We're seeing the evolution of patient advocacy organizations, of patient influencers, of patients who are curious and seeking out their own what's right answer in their mind and taking more charge of their healthcare as something that's not just a trend. You could see it as a clear mark of how the business is changing and how the patient as a stakeholder is becoming one of the primary audiences to think about.
Patients want to make sure they have a clinical impact for sure. They're looking to improve their disease management in terms of lifestyle or impact of potential AEs. All of those things are what will help patients stay on a treatment longer and or get the most out of it.
Hello and welcome to the MM+M Agency 100 podcast, brought to you this week by Humanity. I'm Jameson Fleming, the editorial director for MM+M and Campaign. For today's conversation, we're talking about the patient's lived experience, evolving dynamics of influence, trust, and value. Today, we're joined by Michael Parisi, Chief Client Officer, and Marissa Polai, President of Patient Engagement and Communications. Marissa, Michael, welcome to the show, and how are you doing today?
Jameson, thank you. Really doing great.
Hi, Jameson. Thanks so much.
Before we get started into the conversation, I do want to talk overall about the year you guys had because it was a strong year. You're up revenue-wise. Like a lot of agencies, first half a little slow in 2025. Second half, you took off like a rocket ship. Momentum carried over into this year. So walk me through the year that was at Humanity and how the agency is evolving.
Yes, Jameson, thank you. I appreciate that. And, as we talked previously, we called it a tale of two halves, in 2025. Like many of our industry counterparts and colleagues, we saw just a lot of delays in the first half of the year. But second half of the year, we saw pipelines popping and investment starting to loosen up again. And really the pressure being put on the business to differentiate assets earlier, to really get back to commercializing and really positioning products in a marketplace that is changing faster than we've ever seen a marketplace change. I think that dynamic is carrying into 2026. But, we're feeling very confident. We feel good about the way the wind is headed for us and the direction of travel. So I'm really encouraged about an early and strong start in 26 and look forward to continuing momentum into the remainder of the year.
It's great to see how you've navigated this year. And yeah, it seemed like there was a lot of uncertainty at the beginning of last year, especially from a federal perspective. And then it seemed like everybody once saw how this was all going to go, things picked up pretty quickly. But let's jump into the conversation that we're here to have today about, patients' lived experiences. At the end of the day, we're all patients in one fashion, and we all have our own habits of how we seek our care. And, one of the things that people have been doing more in general is this idea of the doctor is no longer the sole authority. And what does that mean? That means patients are leveraging their own research to actually negotiate treatment plans rather than just accepting them. So how is this happening from your perspective, and what should brands and healthcare agencies be doing about it?
At Humanity, we really think about, and you'll see our position is about unlocking breakthrough value for our clients and for the stakeholders that they service. And value is not just dollars and cents. It's scientific value. It's clinical value, it is economic value, but of course, the core value to the patient. And so, that dynamic, as you described the Norman Rockwell picture of the doctor in charge and the person sitting and just doing everything the doctor says, that kind of goes out the window in the environment in that we live in. And we're seeing, the evolution of patient advocacy organizations, of patient influencers, of patients who are curious and seeking out their own what's right answer in their mind and taking more charge of their healthcare as something that's not just a trend. You could see it as a clear mark of how the business is changing and how the patient as a stakeholder is becoming one of the primary audiences to think about.
Jameson, as you said, the patient is not just looking at the doctor as the only one who has a voice in that relationship anymore. There's so many more sources that they can go to and places that they can access in terms of gathering information. So it's moved from doctor as the only intermediary to Dr. Google, as we saw many years ago when the internet was just sort of becoming a place of information and sourcing. Now to, obviously use of AI, but seeking out peers, as Michael was mentioning, seeking out other organizations. I think, we have to help our pharma manufacturers and other agencies understand that there are so many other sources to look at and help ensure that the access to that information is accurate for patients and that they know what to do with it. Even as we were talking at the beginning of the session here around, being patients ourselves, I know, as a mom, I default to just being that patient when in a health situation. And so I think we have every end of the spectrum that we really have to remember and think about and ensure that we are participating in helping people to have access to the right information and know what to do with it.
Yeah, and you started to hint at where people are getting some of this information. It's off of Reddit, it's off of TikTok, it's off of Instagram. Yep. Sometimes it's from random strangers on Reddit who you don't know. Sometimes it's from influencers on TikTok you also don't know, but you at least know who they are. You may not know them personally, but people trust these influencers. And so how can pharma teams bridge that authenticity gap working with these people without sounding like they're just trying to sell you a prescription drug?
Yeah, it's a great point. When we talk about social influencers too, and I'm a patient advocate, cancer advocate, and I spend a lot of time with both patient groups, but physicians that are actually using TikTok as a way not to influence, but to inform patient communities and going on Instagram and joining the conversation. There are several great examples out there of physicians that have huge followings because the word trust is such an important piece. And it is one that, our pharma colleagues and our clients can learn from, is get involved with the communities and really understand authentically what their challenges are, participate in the conversation. And I know it's hard. You have to do it in a legal and compliant way, but take that extra step and really understand the communities in which you're working to understand what they value, what they don't value, what they see as really authentic information and usable information. And just, the big push, participate in the conversation, whether that means learning and listening or actually actively engaging. It's just critically important that these patients and patient groups see you as an authentic brand that's trying to do the right thing by them.
Yeah. And Michael, I think the key of that is the consistency. I think we see pharma sometimes trying to participate, but really knowing how and where patients are going and being a true, authentic, Jameson, as you said, and used that word initially, authentic partner to the conversation without trying to control it. So, that's the real balance that our pharma clients have to try and navigate there.
Yeah, Marissa, that point of control is such a big, important one. In the early world of DTC advertising, and you just push communications out one way, and we have to participate in the conversations that are happening 24/7. So really, that is something that I know is challenging for some companies to do it in a compliant manner. But the more participatory you can be, the more actively engaged in the conversation you can be, the more authentic the communication becomes.
Yeah, and I mean some of the conversations around some of these drugs are happening on Reddit. They're happening in communities, in communities online, and they often tell us something clinical trials don't, which is how does it feel to actually live taking that drug? Yeah. And so, what's a blind spot the industry often misses if they aren't looking at these peer-to-peer conversations that are happening in some of these quieter spots on the internet?
Jameson, you used the word blind spot. I think that's exactly it on those elements of day to day, what it feels like to live with a given condition, or day to day, what it feels like to engage in XYZ clinical trial. The pharma companies are looking at the endpoints, and we all know that that's a really critical component of bringing a drug to market. And we're looking for the best impact that we can have on patients in terms of their clinical profile. But as Michael was mentioning before, there's this whole surround sound of, what it's like to live with a condition. And where else you really need to think about how we help patients to manage from getting access to that clinical trial, what it feels like to manage a dosing schedule, how they live with and manage their side effects. So I think, getting access to peer conversations for manufacturers and thinking about that at the clinical trial stage even can really help pharma clients understand the other elements to look at and not just look at the clinical endpoints.
Yeah, and Marissa, I'll add to that. Jameson, one part of our business that grew nicely and continues to grow, we actually have a group that specializes in clinical trial patient interviews to understand the lived experience, to understand the experience of being on a drug that's being investigated. And part of what comes out of some of these interviews are things like AE mitigation, techniques, understanding real burden of illness and articulating that, as Marissa described, enriching that beyond just the clinical endpoint, but really understanding what quality of life with someone with head and neck cancer means. It's quite different than someone with breast cancer. And both are important, both are endpoints, but the dimensions underneath each are really wildly different. And so exploring new techniques, trying things you haven't tried before to enrich your clinical trial programs, I would say is something that we're seeing is becoming really important for people to understand the impact your brand could potentially have on a patient population.
Yeah. And, when you have those conversations with patients and you find out they've taken a less effective drug because it's got fewer side effects or it fits their lifestyle better, is that a failure of the system that they're using a less effective drug, or is that the ultimate form of patient autonomy, or is it somewhere in between those two?
Well, I don't think it's a failure of the system, and I don't think it's just patients being autonomous in decision making. It's probably, it's probably a combination of both in terms of patients want to make sure they have a clinical impact for sure. I mean, that's, they're looking to improve their disease management. At the same time, all of those factors we were talking about earlier in terms of lifestyle or impact of potential AEs, all of those things are what will help patients stay on a treatment longer and or get the most out of it. So if I, as an individual, feel like taking one that may on paper look less effective, but all of the other factors around it make it more manageable for me. And to Michael's earlier point, so that I see value in taking this treatment and I actually can get the benefits out of it, even if those benefits may be slightly less efficacious, I may go that route because, again, the full picture of what it feels like to bring that product into my lifestyle may be better for me.
And Jameson, those are the types of stories that patients share with each other all the time. Tips and tricks on how to get the most out of a therapy. To Marissa's point, it may appear on paper to be less efficacious, but if it works for me and doesn't take away from my life, that may be a better option. So ultimately, the decision is the individual's decision. And that is a good one if it works for that person. And once that happens, the amount of sharing and the amount of lived experience sharing that happens between patients can be incredibly impactful. And it happens all the time.
Yeah. And Jameson, I think the point about system failure, I think it only becomes that if the reason that the patient is choosing one product over another is not just because of efficacy or some of these other lifestyle factors, but when it becomes things like cost or access, things that we as part of the healthcare system can help them control, then I think it is part of the system's job to help support patients in being able to make those decisions for what works for them.
Yeah. And look, I mean, every agency out there will always tell you they're patient first. And I know Humanity is 100% the same. But sometimes, with pharma, the relationship with patient advocacy groups isn't as strong as it needs to be. So, what is the biggest cultural barrier inside of pharma companies that's preventing them from maybe partnering as transparently as they could be with patient advocacy groups?
Yeah, this is an area that I've worked in for 25 plus years. It's a passion of mine, and bridging that gap between pharma and advocacy is critically important. And you're right. If you look at every website, whether it's a pharma company, a biotech company, there's always a patient sentiment in there somewhere. There's a couple things that I see that really define who does it really well. and, where there's area for improvement. And one of them is engaging early. And that's even before you're in market, when you're in early clinical trials, really understanding. The advocacy groups, they offer a wealth of knowledge around terms that we use all the time, like the patient journey. They live these journeys every day. They could be a tremendous source of information and insight, but we tend to actually reach out to them when it's too late. We're getting ready to launch and we need to understand the dynamics and it's T-6 months. That's way too late. And so the sooner in clinical trials you can engage with these groups and understand that they're a peer and that they do offer incredible insight, information, scientific advisors, advisory boards. There's a lot of resources that you can tap into, but you have to be open to looking at them just like you do a KOL, and put them in that same category of stakeholder importance. And then you'll start to see how it gets incorporated into a culture and how it gets incorporated into ways of working as well.
Michael, one of the things I think we also observe in working on both sides with pharma and with the advocacy groups is that the groups really move at the speed of the community. They're looking to support patients in real time. And often our pharma partners, unfortunately, are moving at the speed that their organization can, or that their decision-making processes or review cycles and processes can. And that's where it becomes an unfortunate rub because, I think the advocacy groups are really expecting their pharma partners to be there with them. And while pharma says that, I think the actions need to follow, and they need to engage in a longer term relationship that might not exactly follow the internal processes that a pharma company has to go through.
And a lot of this conversation has centered around this idea that patients have more information at their disposal. And one of the ways they are getting this information is through an AI-generated pre-diagnosis. Sometimes can be a good thing, sometimes can be a bad thing, but it can often be a point of tension with their HCP. And so how can HCPs view these pre-informed patients as collaborators rather than disruptions?
Yeah, and so we've been doing a lot of work with advocacy organizations to help train or just inform their constituents of what good AI use. And I can tell you some horror stories of people that are recording their doctor's visit literally on their phone and putting it into, open evidence or putting it into a chat to try and decode and get the types of questions they should ask, their doctor, but not knowing about any of the confidentiality that, is going out the door. So we are educating a lot of the PAGs, patient advocacy groups, on best practices and how, physicians should also look at the source and patients should look at the source of the information when they do get it. So some tips and tricks, really thinking about organizing the information and structuring it around what do you want to get out of the visit? And so what questions do you have for your physician? So it should be it's meant to try and make the appointment more efficient and to get my questions answered that I want answered, not to go in and challenge the doctor. But as you know, a lot of people, when they get in front of the doctor, the white coat syndrome, they kind of panic, or they may have some intended questions that the minute the physician comes in, they go out the window and they get nervous. And if you're dealing with cancer or serious illness, you could see how that can happen. So, a well-laid plan, understand the objectives you want to get out of the meeting with your physician, and really use it to help facilitate a more productive conversation and not challenge authority or thinking as step 1 and 2.
I think that's exactly it, Michael, that the AI generated outputs can be a really helpful starting point. But, I think on both sides, for the physician not to see that as a threat, and for the patients to understand that the information that they have has to be validated by a physician for who they are as an individual, and just to ensure that the sources that they've gotten that information from are credible enough. We had a patient council meeting with some of our external experts a couple weeks ago, and this topic came up. It was one that we put on our agenda, and one of the quotes that came out, I think that was really powerful for us, was around AI mimicking the empathy that patients want to get from their doctors. So, if you have a physician with a bit less bedside manner, you have people who are going to AI engines to get that kind of response that they're hoping that they get from a physician or a peer or a family member when they're talking about their health management. I think that's the part we probably have to be more concerned about than, the actual information itself, is that, people are leaning on some of these other platforms to get the information and get it in a way that they really should be getting it through human connection.
Yeah, and ultimately, a couple questions that we've talked through here have revolved around access. And the last question I want to ask you on this topic is: we've seen a lot more direct-to-patient, direct-to-consumer models, the rise of these platforms for some of the biggest pharma companies. It's been an initiative of the Trump administration to get medicine in people's hands easier with fewer barriers. So is this actually making access easier, or are we just creating a whole new set of gatekeepers out there?
Yeah, I think, Jameson, that's a great question, and one that we are starting to rally a steering committee around as well, from some of the experts in our access team. I do think it could be a new set of gatekeepers, as you called them. But in all of it, one of the biggest challenges I think that we hear from patients in our healthcare system overall is understanding the difference of roles across some of those different groups. So what can my employer group provide to me? What does my health insurer provide to me? What does my physician provide? What about, the rise of specialty and direct pharmacies? So I think, our challenge in being communicators with pharma manufacturers is helping them to help patients understand where and how you get your product and or information from all of these, these different potential gatekeepers. But it's something that I think we're going to see continue to evolve as we go forward.
Yeah, and I would agree. And the other thing I'll say is, we tend to focus on drug, but there is a huge explosion of diagnostics that, are available to consumers: cancer testing, screenings, Cancer Guard, big comprehensive platforms that can test either risk or early detection. Could be really good in terms of uncovering, early diagnoses. A lot of people are paying out of pocket for these. The question is then, what happens if you do get positive result, and who do you turn to if your physician, didn't say you should do it, you just did it on your own? So this early diagnosis, these at-home diagnostics are also, I think they're exciting, and they offer a lot of real potential clinical benefit ultimately, but they do come with then an onslaught of information and action that a patient would have or consumer would have to take after taking such a test. So that's something I think upstream we really need to look at as well.
Yeah, it's a really interesting point. I hadn't really thought about the whole idea of, coverage of some of these diagnostic tests, because it could ultimately save insurance companies and the whole healthcare system a lot more money down the road with an early detection 3, 6, 12 months earlier than you would have expected potentially.
Yeah. And some of them fall within like an FSA account. So people are using their discretionary funds to take some of these tests. And so it's interesting. It's opening up the conversation around diagnostics quite a bit.
Awesome. Well, thank you, Michael and Marissa. I've got one final question for you today. This year's theme for Agency 100 is video games. So this is going to be a fun one. What video game best encapsulates Lumanity right now?
Oh, geez. Marissa, go ahead.
Wow.
You first.
Wow, that's a good one. I might have to say Mario Kart. And so my reason for that is a bit nostalgia. I think Lumanity is built on a really strong heritage and history of a number of different organizations and groups and expertise that have come together. So that's sort of the nostalgia part and the history. And then, I think the racetrack theme and, different characters, if you will, is a great representation of, again, the varied capabilities that we have and the folks who sort of run full speed on different tracks, but all come together for the same game. So my vote is Mario Kart.
That's a very impressive answer on the fly. I'll give you that. Michael, anything you want to add?
Absolutely not. That is perfect.
Yep. That was very impressive to pull that one out on the spot. Very well done, Marissa.
That's what also happens when you have kids who pull them out of a dark closet of your husband's too. So.
Oh, yes. I've got a lot of Mario Kart happening in my household at this point. But thank you so much. This was Michael Parisi, the Chief Client Officer, and Marissa Polai, the President of Patient Engagement and Communications, both of Lumanity. Thank you, both of you, for joining me here today on the MM+M Agency 100 podcast.
Thank you, Jameson.
Thanks, Jameson. Take care.